Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're diving into the life and times of Dwight D. Eisenhower.
Oh, this should be good.
Yeah. And, he might seem like a familiar face,
Yeah.
the whole grandfatherly figure.
Right. The guy on the $5 bill.
Exactly. But we're going way deeper than that.
Okay.
What we're really interested in is his role in World War II,
Okay.
particularly his leadership during D-Day and how all of that helped propel the United States to become, a global superpower.
That's fascinating. I mean, Eisenhower's often remembered, as you said, this kind of benign grandfatherly figure
Right.
with a warm smile. But the reality is he was a much more shrewd political operator than people give him credit for.
Absolutely.
He really understood global power dynamics.
Yes. And to help us understand all of this, we're going to be diving into excerpts from an interview with Michelle Parody.
Okay.
She's the author of The Light of Battle, Eisenhower, D-Day, and the Birth of American Superpower.
Catchy.
Yeah, it is. And this interview is featured on the American History Hit podcast. Now she makes a pretty bold statement in one of her Atlantic articles.
Yeah.
She says that on D-Day, the U.S. conquered the British Empire.
Wow. Okay, so right out the gate, we're jumping into some controversy.
Yeah, and we'll see how she backs that up as we go along.
I'm intrigued. Me too.
So to set the stage a bit, it's important to remember that World War II wasn't just about, defeating Nazi Germany.
Right.
It also marked this massive shift in, global power dynamics. Before the war, the world stage was dominated by European empire,
For score.
especially the British Empire. But World War II was really like the death rattle of that old imperial system.
Okay, I've heard historians use that phrase before.
Yeah, and it makes sense.
Yeah.
The old empires, they were exhausted, bankrupt, discredited. The door was wide open for a new power to emerge.
Right. And that's where the U.S. comes in.
Exactly. But it's interesting because the U.S. wasn't exactly welcomed with open arms as this new global leader.
Really? Why not?
Well, you had President Roosevelt, who was a big advocate for democracy and decolonization,
Okay.
which back then, those ideas sounded pretty radical. The British in particular, they were not thrilled about it.
I can imagine.
They viewed Roosevelt as kind of naive and unrealistic.
So you have this tension brewing.
Yeah, on one side, you've got the British skeptical of this idealistic American vision.
Right.
And on the other side, you've got the Americans eager to establish a new world order.
And it's right in the middle of all of this that Eisenhower steps onto the world stage.
And to think, this is a man who came from very humble beginnings.
Right. Kansas farm boy.
Yeah, exactly. And, early in his career, he even admired strongmen like Mussolini.
That's wild when you consider his later accomplishments.
I know. It makes you wonder, how did this seemingly ordinary guy become such a pivotal figure?
Right. How did he shape the American century?
Yeah. Well, Michelle Parody digs into all of this in her book. She reveals a side of Eisenhower that's often overlooked. She paints a picture of a much more complex and strategic leader than the smiling Ike image we're so used to.
I mean, he was a 5-star general.
Yeah, he wasn't afraid to play the game of power, and a big part of his success was his ability to learn from others.
In what way?
Well, he had this incredible knack for cultivating mentors throughout his career. He learned from the best, but he also learned from the worst.
Interesting.
He observed leadership styles and took note of what worked and what didn't.
So it's like he was constantly building his own leadership playbook.
Exactly. So with all of that as background, let's turn to one of the most pivotal moments of the war.
Okay.
The decision of who would lead the Allied forces in Europe for the D-Day invasion.
Right. Huge decision.
Now, you would think the obvious choice would be George Marshall.
Makes sense. The Army Chief of Staff, he was the most experienced leader.
Exactly. But Roosevelt surprised everyone and chose Eisenhower instead.
Wow. So why do you think Roosevelt went with Eisenhower over Marshall?
Well, it wasn't just a random decision. Marshall was absolutely vital in Washington,
Okay.
overseeing the entire war effort. He was indispensable there.
Right, but there has to be more to the story.
There is Parody uncovered some private correspondence that revealed another reason.
I knew it.
Apparently, Roosevelt was concerned about Marshall's temperament. Remember that whole incident at the Cairo conference?
Oh, yeah, where Marshall almost came to blows with the British General Alan Brooke.
Yeah, during the D-Day planning.
Can you imagine these high-ranking military leaders almost getting into a fistfight?
It's crazy, right?
Yeah.
But it highlights the immense pressure they were all under.
Yeah, the stakes were incredibly high.
Exactly. Any miscalculation could have had disastrous consequences. So it seems Roosevelt picked up on this and realized he needed someone with a bit more finesse.
I see.
Someone who could maintain unity among the allies, smooth things over, and keep everyone working together.
So Eisenhower was the diplomat.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He was known for his ability to build consensus and navigate these complex relationships. He was the perfect fit for this challenging role. But it wasn't just about managing these big personalities.
Right. He also had to manage all those troops.
Exactly.
Right.
Eisenhower had to manage over 1.5 million American troops stationed in Britain.
Wow, that's a lot of people.
It was. And he was dealing with racial tensions, cultural clashes, all sorts of challenges. It must have been a constant balancing act.
Yeah, like walking a tightrope.
Exactly. He had to be sensitive to the different needs of his troops while maintaining discipline and focus on the mission.
It's a testament to his leadership that he was able to pull it off.
And it leads us to another interesting aspect of Eisenhower's leadership, how he deliberately framed D-Day as a liberation and not a conquest.
Okay, that's an important distinction.
It is. He was incredibly meticulous about the language that was used, even correcting his subordinates when they slipped up.
Fascinating. So even word choices played a role in his broader strategy.
Absolutely. He understood that this wasn't just a military operation. It was about shaping the narrative, setting the stage for the post-war world.
Right, influencing how the U.S. would be perceived on the global stage.
Exactly. It wasn't just about winning the war, it was about winning the peace as well.
And this marked a significant shift in American foreign policy.
Right, the old over-there attitude of World War I.
Where the U.S. tried to stay out of European entanglements.
Exactly. That was replaced by a much more collaborative approach. Eisenhower recognized that the U.S. could no longer afford to be isolationist.
So they had to be actively involved in shaping the world order.
Yes, and this collaborative approach, this emphasis on multilateralism, it really laid the groundwork for the institutions that would come to define the post-war period.
You're talking about things like the United Nations, the Marshall Plan, the whole idea of collective security.
Exactly. It's incredible to think that the seeds of this new world order were being sown even as the battles raged on.
Yeah, that's a powerful thought. But amidst all of this strategizing and diplomacy, it's important to remember the immense pressure Eisenhower was under.
Oh, absolutely. Parody mentions this incredible note that he wrote just before D-Day.
Oh, I think I've heard of this. A note meant to be released only if the operation failed.
That's the one. It's a chilling document. You can almost feel the weight of responsibility bearing down on him as he writes.
I bet.
He fully intended to take the blame if things went wrong, shielding his troops and allies from any criticism.
Wow, he was ready to sacrifice his own reputation to protect those under his command.
Exactly. And what's even more striking is what he chose to leave out of that note.
What do you mean?
Well, there were phrases where he started to make excuses, where he hinted at shifting blame, but he crossed those out.
He was determined to own the potential failure completely.
Yeah, that's true leadership in action.
It's a powerful reminder that true leadership is about service and responsibility, not just about glory.
Absolutely. He understood that the ultimate burden of command rested on his shoulders, and he was prepared to bear that burden alone.
So it makes you wonder, what if D-Day had failed?
Oh, man, the consequences would have been immense.
Oh.
The U.S. would have suffered a humiliating defeat. Their credibility on the world stage would have been shattered.
It's hard to even imagine.
I know, the British would have likely retained their dominance in the alliance,
Right.
leaving the Soviets as the sole major power on the European continent.
And the entire balance of power would have shifted dramatically.
It's a chilling thought. It makes you realize just how pivotal Eisenhower's leadership was during this period.
For sure. And it makes you think about the impact of his decisions on the world we live in today.
Absolutely. We'll delve more into that in our next episode.
Looking forward to it.
So it's almost impossible to overstate the significance of D-Day.
Yeah, it was a massive military undertaking, of course, but it also represented this turning point in history
Right.
where the torch of global leadership was, in a sense, being passed.
Michelle Parody argues that this passing of the torch wasn't exactly a peaceful handover.
Yeah, she uses the word conquered to describe the U.S. relationship with the British Empire.
Conquered. That's a strong word.
It is. It suggests something more than just a natural shift in power.
So how does she support that claim?
Well, she points to a few key things. First, there's the economic reality. Britain was heavily in debt to the U.S. after the war.
Right.
And this gave the U.S. immense leverage in shaping the post-war economic order.
Okay, so we see this play out in the establishment of the Bretton Woods system.
Exactly where the U.S. dollar becomes the world's reserve currency.
So the U.S. was essentially calling the shots financially.
Pretty much. And then there's the military aspect. Parody argues that D-Day, while a collaborative effort on the surface,
Right.
really solidified American military dominance.
Okay.
She points out that the U.S. provided the bulk of the troops and resources for the invasion.
And I remember reading in her book how Eisenhower, despite facing resistance from some of his British counterparts, insisted on an American general leading the ground forces on D-Day.
Oh, that's a great example of how Eisenhower, while skilled at diplomacy, wasn't afraid to assert American authority when it mattered.
Yeah.
He understood that this was a chance for the U.S. to prove its military capabilities on a global scale.
And it wasn't just about military might. Parody also talks about how the U.S. used its cultural influence to shape the post-war world.
Right, what she calls the Americanization of Europe.
Yeah, think about the influx of American music movies, consumer goods after the war.
It had a profound impact on European culture and further solidified the U.S. as this dominant force.
Not just militarily and economically, but culturally as well.
Exactly. It's interesting to consider how all of these pieces fit together.
Yeah, it wasn't just one event or one decision.
Right. It was this confluence of factors that allowed the U.S. to rise to superpower status.
And it's important to note that this wasn't necessarily a deliberate plan on the part of the U.S.
No, it was more of an evolution, a response to the circumstances of the time.
But what's remarkable is how Eisenhower, in many ways, anticipated and guided this evolution.
Yeah, he seemed to have this innate understanding of the bigger picture, the long game.
And that brings us back to his leadership style. He wasn't just focused on winning battles.
Right. He was thinking about how to build a lasting peace, how to create a world order that would benefit the U.S. in the long run.
And that's where his focus on multilateralism comes in.
Exactly. He understood that the U.S. couldn't achieve its goals alone. They needed allies, partners, a system of international cooperation.
And these ideas, which we might take for granted today, were quite radical at the time.
They were. And Eisenhower faced opposition from those who clung to the old ways of thinking.
Right, those who believed in power politics and spheres of influence.
But he persisted, and his vision ultimately prevailed.
And we see this reflected in the institutions that emerged after the war. The United Nations, for example, embodied this idea of collective security.
Right. Nations coming together to resolve disputes peacefully.
And then there's the Marshall Plan, which provided billions of dollars in aid to help rebuild Europe.
Which was a remarkable act of generosity, but it was also a strategic move.
Right. By helping Europe get back on its feet, the U.S. was creating a bulwark against Soviet expansionism.
And fostering economic ties that would benefit both sides.
So it was a win-win situation.
Absolutely. And it's a testament to Eisenhower's understanding of how to wield power effectively.
Yeah.
He wasn't just about military strength.
He recognized the importance of economic and diplomatic tools.
Yeah, in achieving U.S. foreign policy objectives.
And it's interesting how his personal experiences shaped his worldview.
Oh, absolutely. His humble upbringing instilled in him a sense of pragmatism.
And a belief in the power of hard work.
His military career taught him the importance of discipline, strategy, teamwork.
And his exposure to different cultures broadened his perspective.
And made him more receptive to new ideas.
Oh.
All of these experiences converged to create the leader who would guide the U.S. through this pivotal moment in history.
It's almost like he was destined for this role.
Perhaps,
Yeah.
or perhaps it was simply a matter of being the right man in the right place at the right time.
Either way, it's clear that Eisenhower played a crucial role in shaping the course of history, and his legacy continues to influence the world today.
His emphasis on multilateralism, his belief in the power of diplomacy, his understanding of the interconnectedness of the world.
These are all lessons that remain relevant in the 21st century.
Absolutely. As we face new challenges from climate change to global pandemics, it's worth remembering the lessons of the past.
The lessons of leaders like Eisenhower, who navigated tumultuous times with wisdom, courage, and a deep sense of responsibility.
They remind us that even in the darkest of times, there is always hope.
And that by working together, we can overcome any obstacle and build a better future for all. It's inspiring to think about how one person can make such a difference.
It is. And it reminds us that each of us has the potential to shape the world around us.
But it's also important to acknowledge the complexity of history.
Oh, for sure. There's a tendency to simplify things, to create heroes and villains. But the reality is much more nuanced.
Absolutely. Leaders like Eisenhower, while admirable in many ways, were also products of their time.
They made decisions based on the information they had and the constraints they faced.
And it's our responsibility to examine their decisions critically.
To learn from both their successes and their failures.
And to recognize that history is not just something that happened in the past. It's a living, breathing thing that continues to shape our present and our future.
Exactly. So as we delve deeper into Eisenhower's story, let's keep in mind this idea of complexity.
Let's avoid easy answers and embrace the messiness of history.
Because it's in that messiness, in that gray area between black and white, that we often find the most profound truths.
And it's through understanding those truths that we can truly learn from the past and apply those lessons to the challenges we face today.
Yeah.
It's striking, even though Eisenhower played such a key role in shaping the American century, there's no grand monument to him in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, that is kind of curious, isn't it? I mean, you'd think a figure of his stature would have a prominent memorial right up there with Lincoln and Washington.
You would think so. But maybe that says something about him.
How so?
He was always a team player,
Right.
always deflecting praise, emphasizing the collective effort.
Yeah, Parody talks about that in her book, how Eisenhower really kind of deliberately avoided the spotlight,
Interesting.
preferred to let his actions speak louder than words. He understood the importance of unity,
Right.
especially during those early years of the Cold War, presenting a united front.
It's like he understood the power of symbolism, even in the absence of, a big fancy monument.
Exactly. His leadership was about substance, not spectacle. He focused on building those strong alliances, strengthening institutions, and laying the groundwork for a more stable and prosperous world.
Which brings us back to the question you posed earlier.
Yeah.
What can we learn from Eisenhower's leadership?
Well, I think there are a few key takeaways. First, there's the importance of humility. Despite all of his accomplishments, Eisenhower never let his ego get in the way.
Yeah.
He was always willing to listen to others, to delegate authority, to share credit.
That's such a valuable lesson for any leader, really.
Oh, absolutely. And second, there's the importance of strategic thinking. Eisenhower was always looking ahead, anticipating challenges, planning for the long term.
He wasn't just reacting to events, he was shaping them.
Exactly, like playing chess while everyone else is playing checkers.
I like that. And finally, there's the importance of collaboration. Eisenhower understood that the U.S. couldn't go it alone in the world. He fostered these strong alliances, built international institutions, promoted multilateralism.
A way to address those global challenges.
Right. And those lessons are just as relevant today as they were back then. I mean, we live in a complex, interconnected world.
We do.
The challenges we face, they transcend national borders.
Absolutely. Climate change, pandemics, economic instability, terrorism.
You name it.
All these issues that require collective action. And Eisenhower's approach to leadership offers a valuable model.
For navigating these turbulent times.
For sure. So as we wrap up this deep dive into Eisenhower's legacy, I think it's worth thinking about what the world might look like today.
Yeah.
Had he not been at the helm during this really crucial period.
It's a fascinating thought experiment, right? I mean, would the U.S. have emerged as a superpower in the same way? Would the Cold War have played out differently? Would we even have the institutions that, underpin the global order today?
Right. Those are questions we can only speculate on. But what's undeniable is that Eisenhower left an indelible mark on history.
He guided the U.S. through this period of profound change, shaping the course of the 20th century and laying the groundwork for the world we live in today.
His legacy continues to inspire us, reminding us that even when facing adversity, we can achieve great things through courage, wisdom, and a commitment to working together.
Well said. Well, that's about all the time we have for today. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the life and leadership of Dwight D. Eisenhower. We hope you found it insightful, and we encourage you to keep exploring his story and the impact he had on the world.